Gauguin, having already shown the lack of necessity on the part of the painter to depict pastoral landscapes through symbolism rather than color alone, would set the foundation for the next generation of 20th century painters. Matisse, seen here having painted a woman with a hat, took Impressionism and further perversed contour. Now almost completely removing it, color is used to define objects. His brushwork and color choices were described by a critic as akin to wild beasts. From here, art galleries slowly begin to have participants that state, my kid could have done that. Here, the pointillist dot and the brushwork of Monet blend together as color comes to define pictures and portraiture rather than illustration. Bad drawing becomes the norm as the color theory which permeated Seurat's work are blended with the necessity to capture the impression light leaves on the eye. Emanating a cool gaze from the middle left hills and sunset, this pastoral scene, one akin to those seen before drawn by Titian in accord with the nymphs of Greek myth, uses color choice to establish hierarchy in the painting. The saturation and hues of the colors, while mixed, leaves an impression on the eye that, in allowing the blending of colors through their presence and contrast in relation to one another, serves to saturate the sky through the blurring between white canvas and color choices. The tree here, painted blue, has no difficulty stating its presence. To understand it in the context of art history and our own lives is enough for us to understand it as such. Think, after all, of a potted plant you would put in your own home. Is that really a plant, a tree, or anything else related to nature, or an ornament you planted or brought home to remind you what nature is? The trees and lawns in your front lawns are not trees. They are ornaments, man made, that we have decided to treat as such. This extrapolation of the ornamentation of life, Matisse's saturation of colors and absolution of contours, seen here in the sensuality of Le Bonheur de Vivre, emancipating colors into their absolutes in difference to the pointillist, women here, displayed in the nude, barely classify as such. Lacking any tonal variety in color and shading to activate the scene outside of flat appearance, its super-flat nature is only outdone by its ability to establish shape and presence through color blocking and contrast alone. Depth, rather than be created through shading, perspective, and color, by drawing hills in front of one another and then shading them in, is instead established by the slow gradient of bright green-yellow that blends into red-orange-red from right to left in the painting. Color choices are depicted snaking around the blue-green of the lovers in the front and leading us into the dancers in the center of the image as, rather than simply throwing color onto a painting already outlined, color itself, and its ability to move through the color spectrum, becomes the way by which to establish the fate of the women painted. When asked about the philosophy behind painting, Matisse stated, color was not given to us so that we could imitate nature. It was given to us so we could express our emotions. To Matisse, it was not a simple question of what colors to choose to depict reality. He believed that some blues were more blue than others, and that when necessary, the right answer was always simply to add more blue. It was not the quality of the color that depicted the artist's autobiography of his world, but rather, it was the quantity of blue that ennobled him to capture man's need for decoration. For this reason, art critic Clement Greenberg would write, decoration is the specter that haunts modernist painting, and part of the latter's formal mission is to find ways to use the decorative against itself. Marat's death and the freedom to split off from the church would eventually lead to such a hypocrisy of values, decoration used against decoration, until inevitably Hitler, when denied entrance into art school, rose to power in Germany as a result. 1905 would mark the year Matisse threw his own blue nude, one so grotesque it drew the ire of the majority of critics who gazed upon his own eroticism through the figure. Now fully turning the idea of woman and her nude ornate, highlighting his own quality to do so, rather than trying to portray his idea of a woman through his ability to accurately capture one in paint. The strange contours and body posture would eventually catch the eye of Pablo Picasso, despite having not caught the attention of the men who wished to consume her. Contradicting his own innate desire for ornamentation in painting against man's desire for the woman as his ornament, When questioned about her appearance, Matisse replied, "If I met such a woman in the street, I would run away. I do not create a woman, I make a picture." Like the simplicity of his belief in adding more blue, the plenitude of color and aesthetic was merely enough to depict the difficulty of this woman to try to become appealing to her onlookers. Eventually undertaking Matisse's ordeal of representation as his own, Picasso looked not simply to ornamentation as the foundation of his works. Pictured here is one of his most famous paintings, The Woman of Avignon, depicted in what he would consider the nudes of five women, all prostitutes, at a brothel on Carrer Davinci, a street in Barcelona. Drawing first on inspiration from the painter Cezanne and later African masks, Picasso realized that it was not necessary to paint or even draw eyes to symbolize them. That is to say, as it is on the left-hand side, a woman's arms can depict her bending over and her arms at the same time, similar as it did in Caravaggio's Entombment of Christ. The African mask here serves the same function. We do not know that the cylinders there are eyes until we have been trained and conditioned to do so. This means that in the case of a painting such as this one, Picasso is free to abstract perspective and the means by which it communicates depth, context, and meaning, without needing ever to truly draw it. Summarized by the statement once more, "But my kid could do that," it is the context of Picasso's artistry and his ability to convey dimension without ever complaining of being restricted by the laws of lighting and shading the oath of Harari was restrained to, that made him a master in the eyes of the West. Here, perspective is destroyed altogether, alongside figurative representation as, for example, in the top right-hand corner, a woman's breast can be represented by simple diamonds on her chest, reflecting both her breast staring outwards towards us while turning to face her simultaneously. The drapery from which she stands behind juts out between her and the woman standing directly on the left of her, in front of its blue hues. Each woman, as do all prostitutes, is trying to turn and contort their bodies to their clientele, hoping to draw him to her as she poses in a myriad of flashes drawing men to her body. If Matisse hoped to give you blue by simply giving you more blue, Picasso argued he would not have to even show you the color blue to give it to you. Destroying the entirety of Western tradition and its necessity to capture mythological forms in the female nude through biography, Picasso eventually boils down all representation into triangles, using the geometric shape as the basis for all future depiction. Now able to paint as freely as possible, color and depiction are thrown out as simple means by which to express ornamentation, as Matisse did. Color and color harmony are still kept intact, as instead of using it to express simple aesthetic consumption, it is the nature of representation as a whole that is questioned. Rather than make a painting in the name of beauty, the nature of beauty, of visual language, of what it means to write a biography, is itself called into question. Is it our ability to capture what we consider to be real that makes us able to write biography, or instead, is the question of having made biography in the first place that restricts us from our own humanity? Have we yet to capture the totality of vision, or by that virtue, by creating and dreaming of new words and ways to organize them? Or is instead the simple fact that we have drawn letters to represent the words that emanate from our mouths that which has restricted us from beauty in the first place? What would it mean, as Picasso does here, to simply write a biography made only of vowels, to try to portray three women as musicians such as Miles Davis do, by removing the need for language altogether and simply express his vision of reality through sound alone? Are these even women at all, or have we, through our own history, simply placed themselves alongside our own history to create the illusion that they are? Pushing this to its extreme, Picasso forgoes artistry and canvases altogether as he begins to paint and make art out of scrap materials. Taking a rope to enclose this tableau, table in French, and making it a painting, also referred to a tableau in French. The religious nature of art is demystified as instead of being enclosed in canvases by the Western tradition, Picasso's works are enclosed by the simple materials made by men before him. Now, art is not simply defined by an artist's ability to paint on canvas. Instead, in already having established himself as an artist, the objects in this work are kept as biographies based on Picasso's subjective ability to depict them only through signification alone, in relation to one another, not our preconceived notions of what it means to have a cup painted on a table. Picasso did not simply choose to paint a still life so he could eternalize these objects and the lifestyle they represent. Rather, he paints a biography of how we have been conditioned to partake in signification. Biographies such as this one are not simply those of a man or of his body and image. Instead, they are stories of his life, as told through the objects and food he consumes as part of his lifestyle. Each one is a small engineering work that was at the time considered, despite their beauty, lowest on the hierarchy of Western painting. These images want to be believed for their ability to signify the objects we see in our day to day lives, rather than be part of the mythology and identity a nation hoped to achieve as done in history paintings. Rather than teach history through mythology, it captures a single moment in a single swoop of illusion. Rather than try to simply capture a cup's beauty, it captures it in relation to the rest of the scene, each item and background part of the same illusion that works only in relation to each other signifier in the image. This is, of course, what Picasso hopes to do entirely away with. Rather than need to create an image and series of objects that signify one another in relation to each other, Picasso finds a way to signify that a newspaper is a violin through a series of poetic axioms about the nature of illusion and representation in painting. Reducing an object only to its essentials, the work should be read as a series of contradictory opposites. This is, of course, what Picasso hopes to do entirely away with. Rather than need to create an image and series of objects that signify one another in relation to each other, Picasso finds a way to signify that a newspaper is a violin through a series of poetic axioms about the nature of illusion and representation in painting. Reducing an object only to its essentials, the work should be read as a series of contradictory opposites, suggesting wood grain of the violin through the newspaper and the atmospheric shadow of the piece's background. The illusion is best kept hidden and revealed by the presence of the parallel S's on the violin, as well as the head of the violin drawn half in profile and then redrawn in a moving motion to represent movement. Picasso, showing the illusion and removing it at the same time, minimizes the need for perspective by, through signification, admitting to the fact that the violin is turned away from us without drawing it as such in relation to the objects around it. Absence, not presence, becomes the violin's condition. There is no truth to this painting, Picasso states. Only a series of values Picasso has placed on signifiers to show the relationship between them as depth. Signification then becomes unstable as it is rendered to a series of visual axioms. What then can be said as we flatten ourselves and our reality to the signifiers of the internet? Could such a social media world be possible, one absent of truth, of minimal signifiers, as Picasso does with his violin? When asked as to why our IQ levels were higher than our parents, scholars James Flynn had this to say. We are going to take a quick voyage over the cognitive history of the 20th century, because during that century our minds have altered dramatically. We've gone from a people who confronted a concrete world and analyzed that world primarily in terms of how much it would benefit them, to people who confront a very complex world. This dramatic change was drawn to my attention through massive IQ gap changes over time. We don't just get a few more questions right on IQ tests, we get far more right than each succeeding generation back to the time that they were invented. If you score us against their norms, we would have an average IQ of 130. Now, what we have to imagine is the mental artillery that we have picked up over the 100 years. Laureate looked at people just before they entered the scientific age, and he found that these people were resistant to classifying the concrete world. They wanted to break it up into little bits that they could use. He found that they didn't deal well with abstraction. He talked to the headman of a person in rural Russia. He asked that particular person, "What do crows and fish have in common?" And the feller said absolutely nothing. He was interested effectively in what he could do with those concrete objects. He was unwilling to treat this as anything but a concrete problem. This eventually leads to the horseshoe problem posted here on iFunny almost a century later. While trying to get rid of the illusionary and distance himself from the literature of history painting, a liberal arts education in literature, would eventually become the only way by which to understand modern art. Duchamp, inspired by this, looked to make a name for himself in the world of Western painting in the same way. Depicting here a nude descending down a staircase, he quickly predicted that he would have no future as an artist if he confined himself to the limits of Cubism. Shifting to sculpture instead, he would readily become famous for a series of sculptures he colloquially titled ready-mades. Most famously depicted here in his bicycle wheel, an allegory to masturbation, Duchamp readily realized that, as an artist, he had the right not only to create art, but to assign cultural value to that which he wanted to be treated or analyzed as art. Taking a bicycle wheel from his garage he would spin in boredom, one can imagine the wheel spinning and creating a sense of movement without going anywhere at all, much like a young woman indulging in pornography. In doing so, the whole question of artifice gets thrown out the window. If a mass-produced item with material use was created with ornamentation in mind, that is to say, the ornamentation of the factory that produced it, at what point do we separate that which is mass-produced and the history of modernity subsumed within its production, than that which, in response to this modernity, we deem as being valuable art? How can we, for example, say that this bottle rack is worth any amount of money? Who prescribed it the value? The factory owner that makes money and seeks to make a profit, or the culture we have created around it to engage with the item? These irrational works of art, made without what we would consider an artist to have made them, were granted such questions once, being labeled as art, they could be upheld to the same artistic and philosophical rigor art critics prescribed to painting. Having never gone so far as to label a female nude, a living woman, a piece of art, the question of biography comes into play once more. It is not the illusion that is a bottle rack that Duchamp questions, as Picasso did, but rather the illusion that we have called it one that Duchamp questions. This would lead him, of course, to create his most vulgar and famous work. This fountain, pictured here, brings into question the identity of the Western tradition all at once. White and porcelain like the fountains of ancient Rome, Duchamp's wit comes through as he compares the work of a plumber and the urinal that gets pissed on with the fountains that litter the Western world. Strangely enough, in a world so dominated by white European men as the art world is, Duchamp's ability to piss on their traditions by comparing their works to those of plumbers makes it all the more ironic that his work was appropriated by the abstract expressionists and conceptual art movements of American artists in New York City later in the 20th century. Taking a stand against German philosopher and altruist Kant, who believed art's importance was that it, quote, had no use, that art was autonomous by definition, Duchamp negates this in his inclusion of ready-mades as art. Duchamp says art, and more specifically the kind you speak of, does have a use, as much as this fountain. Duchamp, having entered his sculpture into an art gallery that claimed it would reject no work submitted, had his work rejected on the grounds that it would be absurd and immoral to consider it as such. The mystery of who R. Mutt is remains to this day. Writing to a newspaper under her pseudonym Beatrice Wood, Duchamp had this to say. They say any artist paying $6 may exhibit. Mr. Richard Mutt sent in a fountain. Without discussion, this article disappeared and never was exhibited. What were the grounds for refusing Mr. Mutt's fountain? Some contended it was immoral, vulgar. Others, it was plagiarism, a plain piece of plumbing. Now, Mr. Mutt's fountain is not immoral. That is absurd, no more than a bathtub is immoral. It is a fixture that you see every day in plumbers' show windows. Whether Mr. Mutt, with his own hands, made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object. As for plumbing, that is absurd. The only works of art America has given are her plumbing and her bridges. Marat's bathtub, the ghost of modernism, lays lingering in the background. Christ, nor the remnants of Christianity, ever fully removed from the remains of the West. This trolling tradition, the continued use of irony as a cry for help over time, has bled even further into the 21st century. Ready-mades, now replaced by ready-made meme images, have continued to lay the foundation for Western art as it is now through the collective spreading of images, and the value the internet places on said images, that art pieces such as this troll face have been assigned cultural values. While the Academy may not like it, these images are art, and the people who have repurposed them are the artists of this new generation. Democratized through the internet, art itself has become a series of ready-mades, the Academy replaced by the algorithm as the need for dopamine and digital ornamentation takes precedence over physical ornamentation. Russian constructivists, in search of truer communist art forms, laid down the foundation for their democratic proletariat art like so. On the left are compositions, artworks defined by the bounds of images, in which geometries are composed in the name of aesthetic possibility based on what they considered inferior, less universal, and less scientific principles of art. Works defined as such were deemed enchanted and constrained to the limit of an artist's solitary vision within their studios. Constructions, pictured on the right, were to these communist constructivists three-dimensional forms that took the maximum use of materials in the name of truth and use, absent of superfluous elements of an artist's singular vision restrained onto canvas, a more proletariat art form as a whole. Manifesting in sculptures as those seen here, Rodchenko believed that in the same way that the laborer went to the factory for his motherland, so too could the artist, through engineering and productivism, make art truly communist in the spirit of the proletariat. Vladimir Tatlin, looking outward to the materials of what he wished to design, looked to bend the wills of the materials themselves against the will of the artist. If Impressionists placed value on the hierarchy of colors, Tatlin looked to the materials themselves as the hierarchy by which he would restrain himself to. What form would a meme have to take for it to be the most useful if it is spread on the internet? Tatlin considered himself a co-worker of his materials, not one who could impose his will on them. The material, Tatlin believed, had itself to generate the form, in complete opposition to Picasso, who believed form itself could be subsumed through the artist's paintbrush. Looking out over what he considered factory life, life itself had become a land of material. Rather than looking to critique the nature between the public and private self, as in the West, by restraining himself to the quality of the materials, Tatlin hoped to create a spiritual awakening in his people through the materials and items by which they lived. Hoping to create socialist objects in opposition to the ornamentation of artists such as Morris, Tatlin tried to create a multi-purpose pot to draw the maximum out of the materials he was granted for the common people. Folding the paper in two, he realizes his failure in being able to overcome form in life, as all modern art is summarized in his inability to do so. Consumerism and mass production were reintroduced side by side in 1924 with Tatlin's sports suits. Rejecting the idea of fashion brought by Western bourgeoisie to Russia for a new fashion made in the image of communist principles, desire and need clash together side by side as the warm, unrestrictive sports suits tells its people to reject the necessity of fashion altogether. What makes a man, Tatlin states, is not his own autobiography through wool suits. Instead, it is his communist spirit, the only thing that can be portrayed once everyone wears the same neutral sports suit, as man's consciousness, in the eyes of Tatlin, is deterred by his social existence, not the consciousness that seeks for material desire. If Duchamp believed that art was restrained and existed as a conceptual practice, Tatlin believed it was the materiality of art and design that enabled it to overcome both schools as material practices. Continuing into the 21st century, Marat's death still lingers as, through fashion, companies like Louis Vuitton failed to overcome their own definitions of freedom by bringing in Pharrell Williams as their lead designer. Failing to celebrate Martin Luther King having worn clothes they today label as European, in contrast to Williams' so-called black designs, the spiritual and material consciousness of the West is still restrained by the same definitions Marat died in his bathtub for. The needs of everyday life, and the marketing that it requires to promote it, are still deeply divided from the realities that Martin Luther King died trying to create. Pharrell, empowered by Louis Vuitton, has been granted the ability to assign values that which Vuitton and the West would never do on their own, a parody of Duchamp, as they continue to keep their distance between that which they wish to call Western culture by calling it black culture, despite it becoming part of Western culture by its mere inclusion.